think a plant is? Maybe people don't understand the definitions of these words.
What if everything you thought you knew about Tupac Shakur was only half the story? What if the truth didn't end in 1996? It just went quiet. Because every few years, just when the world starts to move on, a voice rises again, pulling us straight back into the same unanswered question. And this time, that voice is Katt Williams. Now, some people say he's just a comedian, but others believe something very different. That when Katt speaks, he doesn't speculate. He echoes things the industry doesn't want repeated out loud. And that's exactly why every time he mentions Tupac Shakur, the internet doesn't just listen. It reacts like something hidden has been touched again. But here's the real question. Is Katt Williams revealing a buried truth about Tupac's final days? Or is the world simply hearing what it wants to believe because the mystery is more powerful than the answer? Because let's be honest, if everything was already solved, why does this case still feel open? Why do new theories still trend every year? And why does Tupac's name still feel like a question mark instead of a full stop? Music, stay with us, because what comes next is not just a story about an artist. It's about a mystery the world refuses to close. After the hook fades into silence, the real weight of the story begins to settle in, like a shadow that refuses to leave the room. Because once you strip away the viral clips, the half-heard interviews, and the internet noise, what you are left with is something far more grounded and far more uncomfortable. Not a mystery designed for entertainment, but a long-running cultural obsession that keeps reopening wounds that were never fully healed. Katt Williams didn't just become part of this conversation by accident. His name enters these discussions the same way smoke creeps under a door crack, quietly at first, then suddenly impossible to ignore. Every time he speaks in public, especially after his high-profile interviews, the internet doesn't just listen, it interprets. It connects dots that may or may not actually exist. And when Tupac's name enters that space, the reaction multiplies instantly. But here is the first reality check that gets lost in all the noise. There is no verified investigative evidence linking Katt Williams to any official knowledge about Tupac's death. No legal documents, no confirmed testimony, no law enforcement records. What exists instead is something more powerful in the digital age: perception. And perception, once it spreads, behaves like truth even when it isn't. That is why this story never dies. Tupac Shakur remains one of the most analyzed figures in modern music history, not because his case is unsolved in the legal sense alone, but because it sits at the intersection of culture, violence, fame, and unfinished legacy. When someone like Katt Williams references him, even indirectly, audiences don't hear commentary. They hear implication. They hear hidden meaning. They hear possibility. And possibility is where conspiracy is born. To understand why this continues to spiral decades later, you have to understand what Tupac represented at the time of his death. He wasn't just a rapper in 1996. He was a cultural force operating at maximum intensity. Every move he made carried weight, musically, politically, and socially. He wasn't just inside hip-hop. He was shaping its emotional language. That level of visibility comes with a cost most people underestimate. Because the higher someone rises in cultural influence, the more interpretations of their life begin to multiply after they're gone. Friends become suspects. Events become symbols. Conversations become clues. And silence becomes suspicious. That is exactly what happened here. The official framework of Tupac's death remains rooted in a documented sequence of events. The Las Vegas altercation, the drive after the Mike Tyson fight, the stop at the intersection, and the shooting that followed. These are not internet theories, these are established timelines supported by law enforcement reconstruction and hospital records. But timelines don't stop imagination. They only set the stage for it. And on that stage, over the past 30 years, countless narratives have been performed. Some based loosely on witness statements, some built from speculation, some fueled entirely by social media reinterpretation of old interviews and fragmented clips. And then figures like Katt Williams enter the conversation, not as investigators, not as witnesses, but as cultural amplifiers. People who speak in metaphor, humor, and layered commentary. And the audience, already primed by decades of unanswered questions, begins to translate tone into testimony. This is where modern misinformation doesn't even need false evidence. It only needs emotional interpretation. Because when a story is emotionally unresolved, people don't look for closure, they look for meaning. And Tupac's story has never been emotionally closed. The loss wasn't just about one artist. It was about an entire trajectory that ended mid-flight. At the time of his death, Tupac was not only producing music, but also evolving as a public intellectual figure within hip-hop culture. His work reflected contradictions, vulnerability and aggression, political awareness and personal chaos, poetic reflection and street survival instinct. That complexity is part of why he remains difficult to define even today. And complexity is exactly what fuels endless reinterpretation. When people try to make sense of something emotionally heavy, they tend to simplify it into narratives that feel understandable. Good versus bad. Hidden truth versus public lie. Known story versus secret story. But real history rarely fits those structures. Especially not cases like this. One of the most repeated patterns in Tupac-related discussions is the idea that something was hidden. That framing appears in documentaries, interviews, and countless online discussions. But when you examine the strongest verified sources, police documentation, hospital records, and legal proceedings, what you find is not a hidden alternative narrative, but gaps created by incomplete witness cooperation and the limitations of 1990s investigative technology. Those gaps are not evidence of conspiracy. They are evidence of complexity under pressure. And over time, those gaps were filled not by facts, but by storytelling. That storytelling has now become part of pop culture itself. Which is why when modern entertainers reference Tupac, even indirectly, the reaction is immediate and amplified. It is no longer about what was said. It is about what people think it might connect to. This is the environment Katt Williams walks into every time his name gets attached to stories like this. Not a legal investigation, not a verified archive, but a cultural echo chamber where memory, myth, and media blur together. And once that blur happens, separating truth becomes less about evidence and more about discipline. Because discipline is what most viral narratives lack. The real structure of Tupac's final days is actually far less cinematic than internet theories suggest. It is a sequence of real-world decisions, movements, environments, and timing, all colliding in one of the most unpredictable cities in America, Las Vegas, a place built on constant motion, artificial light, and compressed human energy. That night was not operating in isolation. It was part of a larger environment shaped by celebrity culture, music industry tension, and street-level dynamics that were deeply intertwined in mid-90s hip-hop. And when those systems overlap, outcomes become unpredictable without needing hidden masterminds. But unpredictability is not satisfying to the human mind. So narratives evolve, and evolve again, until eventually, the story people know is no longer the story that can be verified. That is the space where Tupac's legacy lives now, between documented history and cultural reinterpretation. And that is why figures like Katt Williams continue to get pulled into it. Not because they provide answers, but because they activate attention. They trigger curiosity loops that were never fully closed. But curiosity is not confirmation. And this is where most online discussions collapse under their own weight. Because the deeper you go into verified records, the more you see that the foundation of this case is not hidden truth, it is unresolved clarity. A situation where some questions remain unanswered not because of secrecy, but because time, circumstance, and evidence limitations created permanent gaps. And those gaps became the canvas for everything that followed. As we move further into this story, the focus shifts away from personalities and toward structure, the structure of how cultural myths are built, how celebrity narratives evolve after death, and how a single unresolved event can continue generating new interpretations decades later. Because Tupac's story is no longer just about what happened in 1996, it is about everything that happened after people decided the story was not finished. And that is where the next layer begins to unfold. And that is exactly where the story stops being about a single night in Las Vegas and starts becoming something much bigger, a long-term cultural echo that refuses to fade. Because once a narrative enters that unfinished space, every new voice, every interview, every viral clip, and every resurfaced quote gets treated like potential missing evidence. Not because it actually is, but because the audience is still searching for emotional closure that history never provided. That is the psychological engine behind all of this. And it explains why Katt Williams' name keeps getting pulled into conversations that are already decades old. In modern internet culture, personalities who speak in bold, metaphor-heavy language often get repositioned as truth carriers, even when their statements are rooted in commentary, not disclosure. The shift happens silently, entertainment becomes interpretation, and interpretation becomes assumed insight. But there is a critical distinction that gets lost. Speaking confidently does not equal speaking factually about historical crimes or unresolved cases. And in Tupac's situation, that distinction matters more than ever. Because the deeper you examine the verified structure of his case, the more you realize something uncomfortable. There is no hidden second file waiting to be revealed. There is no confirmed alternate investigative record that changes the foundation of what is already documented through official channels. The incident timeline, the hospital treatment period, and the subsequent legal developments that followed years later. What does exist is fragmentation. Witness accounts that didn't fully align. Investigative limitations of the era. Gaps in surveillance coverage. And a rapidly evolving media ecosystem that, at the time, was far less equipped to consolidate real-time evidence across jurisdictions. Those are not conspiracy signals. They are structural limitations. But the human brain rarely accepts limitations as an answer when the subject is emotionally powerful. Instead, it replaces them with narrative tension. It turns absence into meaning. It turns silence into implication. And Tupac's cultural impact guarantees that every gap becomes magnified. Because he wasn't just an artist who passed away, he was a symbol whose life already carried political weight, generational identity, and public emotional investment. That combination is rare. And when rare figures exit under unresolved circumstances, the cultural system doesn't close the chapter. It keeps rewriting it. That rewriting process is where most modern bombshell discussions actually live. Not in evidence, but in reinterpretation. So when Katt Williams is mentioned in relation to Tupac, what is really happening is not an investigative update, it is a cultural transfer. A transfer of attention from verified history into interpretive storytelling. And once that transfer happens, the original facts and the newly created narratives begin to coexist in the public mind as if they carry equal weight. That is how misinformation ecosystems form without needing intentional deception. Just repetition. And emotional engagement. Now, stepping back into the actual case structure, one of the most misunderstood elements is the difference between unresolved and unknown. Tupac's case is not unknown. It has a documented timeline, verified medical outcome, and officially recorded investigative developments over time. What remains is not absence of information, but absence of universally accepted closure on motive, sequence interpretation, and accountability in the broader sense. That gap is what keeps the case alive. And that gap is what entertainment culture continuously reactivates. In the years since, documentaries, interviews, and commentary content have repeatedly revisited the same core moment, the Las Vegas sequence, often re-editing it through new angles, slow-motion analysis, or retrospective testimony. Each retelling creates the illusion of new discovery, even when the underlying material remains unchanged. This is where the internet changes the rules of memory. Because in traditional journalism, repetition without new evidence weakens a claim. But in digital storytelling, repetition strengthens visibility, and visibility often gets mistaken for validation. That is why the Tupac narrative expands instead of resolving. And that expansion creates space for outside voices to be inserted into the conversation, even if their actual connection is indirect or purely interpretive. A comedian's metaphor becomes a hint. A podcast statement becomes a reveal. A clipped sentence becomes a missing piece. This transformation is not accidental. It is structural to how viral culture processes unfinished history. But underneath all of it, the verified backbone remains unchanged. Tupac was shot in Las Vegas on September 7, 1996, after a series of events connected to a high-profile boxing match night, and he later passed away on September 13, 1996, following sustained critical injuries and medical intervention. That sequence is established through official records and hospital documentation, not speculation. Everything beyond that point, motive debates, expanded theories, and symbolic interpretations, belongs to interpretation layers built over time. And those layers are where cultural figures like Katt Williams get pulled in, whether intentionally or not. Because modern audiences are not just consuming facts anymore, they are consuming narratives that feel like they explain emotional discomfort. And Tupac's story, by its very nature, leaves emotional discomfort unresolved. That is why it keeps resurfacing. Not because it changes, but because audiences do. And as long as that emotional loop remains open, the story will continue to regenerate itself through new voices, new formats, and new interpretations, each one presented as if it is finally the missing piece. But the reality is simpler and far less sensational. The core facts are already known. What remains is how people choose to emotionally process them. And that is where the next layer of this discussion begins to shift from the myth-making machine back toward the psychology of why unfinished cultural stories never truly die, no matter how many times they are retold, reframed, or repackaged for a new generation of viewers. And that is where the conversation shifts one final time, away from speculation, away from recycled narratives, and back toward the uncomfortable truth about how cultural memory actually works. Because at a certain point, every high-profile story like Tupac stops being just about what happened and starts becoming about what people need it to mean. That is the real engine underneath all the re-emerging interviews, resurfaced clips, and viral commentary moments tied to his name. The human mind does not like unfinished emotional files. When something feels too significant to end cleanly, it keeps reopening it through new voices, new theories, and new interpretations, even when the factual foundation has not changed. That is why names like Katt Williams get pulled into the orbit of older tragedies and mysteries. Not because they are officially connected, but because modern audiences have merged entertainment commentary with investigative assumption. In that space, tone becomes evidence and confidence becomes authority, even when neither is supported by verified records. But when you strip all of that away, what remains is still the same documented historical core. A real human life. A real shooting event in Las Vegas in 1996. A real hospital timeline that followed. And a real cultural impact that never stopped expanding afterward. Everything else built on top of that. The reinterpretations, the documentaries, the theories, the hidden meaning breakdowns, exists in a secondary layer. A layer shaped more by emotional processing than by factual discovery. And that distinction is where most online discussions collapse. Because people are not just asking what happened. They're also asking, how could this happen to someone like him? And when a question carries emotional weight, the brain naturally seeks patterns that make the outcome feel structured, intentional, or explainable. That is where conspiracy narratives find their strength. Not in evidence, but in emotional demand. Tupac's legacy sits at the center of this because he represented more than music. He represented identity, resistance, contradiction, and expression at a level that blurred the line between artist and symbol. When someone becomes a symbol of that magnitude, their death stops being processed as an isolated event and starts being treated as a cultural rupture. And cultural ruptures rarely get accepted quietly. They get revisited, rewritten, reanalyzed, and reinterpreted across generations. That is why, nearly 3 decades later, the conversation is still active. Not because new verified facts continuously emerge, but because each new generation encounters the same emotional gap for the first time and tries to fill it with the tools of their own era: podcasts, clips, commentary channels, interviews, and viral breakdowns. In that ecosystem, even unrelated voices can become attached to the narrative simply because they participate in the conversation surrounding it. But participation is not confirmation. Commentary is not disclosure. And cultural relevance is not investigative authority. Those lines matter more here than in almost any other type of story, because this case sits at the intersection of real tragedy and digital myth-making. And the longer it circulates in that hybrid space, the more it becomes a mirror reflecting the audience rather than the event itself. So when Katt Williams is mentioned in connection with Tupac, what you are really seeing is not a new chapter in the investigation, but a reflection of how modern media reactivates older cultural pain points and rewraps them in current entertainment language. The truth underneath remains static. The interpretation layer keeps moving. And that movement is what creates the illusion of ongoing revelation. But there is no final hidden file waiting to be opened. No last-minute twist that rewrites the documented timeline. No forgotten evidence that changes the established sequence of events. What exists instead is something more ordinary, but far more important to understand, a culturally significant loss that never received emotional closure at the collective level, and therefore continues to regenerate conversation long after the factual timeline ended. That is why Tupac remains present in discussions today, not because the case is actively evolving, but because the audience relationship with it still is. And as long as that relationship stays open, every new voice that enters the space will be treated as if they are adding something new to the story, even when they are not. In the end, what this entire cycle reveals is not a hidden truth about one night in 1996, but a broader truth about modern storytelling itself. Unresolved emotion is the most powerful fuel for long-term cultural narratives. And Tupac's story, more than almost any other, continues to prove that some legends do not persist because new facts emerge. They persist because people are still trying to emotionally finish a story that history never formally concluded. If this story made you stop and actually think for a moment, then you already understand why it still gets talked about decades later, not because of rumors, not because of noise, but because some stories never fully leave the culture once they enter it at this level. Now the question shifts to you. Do you think stories like this keep coming back because there's something still missing, or because the internet keeps rebuilding them in new ways every time they resurface? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those topics where every perspective adds something to the conversation. People see it differently depending on what they've heard, what they believe, and what era they grew up in. If you found value in this breakdown, don't just scroll past it. Hit the like button so the video reaches more people who actually follow these deeper cultural discussions instead of just surface-level headlines. And if you're into content that goes beyond basic gossip, into real context, breakdowns, and the layers behind viral stories, then subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next video might take you even deeper into stories the internet keeps reinterpreting but never truly resolves. Stay aware, stay critical, and I'll catch you in the next one.